Yeah. Let's start then formally. First of all, on behalf of the Speaking from Margin, I would like to welcome all of you for today's academic discussion series. So before going to tell about the title of the talk and about our speakers and discussant, let me briefly tell about our forum. Speaking from Margin is a student collective an academic platform for research scholars, socio-political activists, and students to engage in contemporary discourses on the social sciences. We attempt to build an academic solidarity for social justice in higher education. This space is dedicated to fostering connections amongst researchers from various marginal locations as we engaged with the evolving knowledge paradigm of the social sciences. In our collective, researchers from SCs, STs, minorities, and OBCs participate to gain a deeper understanding of research methods, conceptualizations, and theorizations in the diverse field of social sciences. We are honored to have received the support of distinguished speakers who shared insights and strengthened to our initiatives. So I'm going to read some of the speakers and scholars, those who have contributed to this initiative. Scholars like Professor Kancha Ilaya, Rajiv Bhargav, Nivedita Menon, Nandini Sundar, Sudhir Kumar Suthar, Meenaketan Behra, Satish Deshpande, Samabrat Chaudhary, Nasrin Chaudhary, Rahul Verma, Neera Chandok, Joya Hassan, Professor N. Sukumar, Urmilesh Maitre Chaudhary, Anvita Abi, Gautam Bhan, Gajala Jamil, Najima Parveen, Umesh Wagade, Scott R. Stroud, Jadumani Manand, Ajay Gudavarti, Mohinder Singh, Brahma Prakash, Khalid Anis Ansari, Eva Rosalie Hojli, Samata Biswas, Nived, Joanna Pop, and many others like David Gelenar, Krishna P. Adhikari, Malavika Vini, V. Gita, Sailaja Menon, Surinder Jotka, and Sandhya Fuchs, among others. Many others also have contributed to this platform. So today in this academic lecture series, title is on the popular print public sphere and the making of anti-caste consciousness in colonial India. To speak on this, we have a young scholar and a visiting professor at Osaka University, Surajkumar Thube. And basically the idea of this title and particularly this talk or the discussion coming out from his recent published article titled Audience of the Print, Satyasodhak Reading Practices and the Emergence of Popular Print Publics in the Journal of South Asian Studies, Routledge. So Suraj has recently completed his PhD from the Faculty of History, University of Oxford. His doctoral thesis titled Towards a Non-Brahmin Hinduism, Caste, Dharma, and Marathi Public Spheres, 1890 and 1930s, looked at how non-Brahmins writers, lower caste or the intermediate caste from Western India, through their writings in newspapers, booklets, and books in Marathi, sought to save the emerging modern Marathi public sphere discourse around Hindu, Dharma, Brahminism, and anti-casteism. He is working on converting his thesis into a book, which is scheduled to publish with Oxford University Press. His articles and books reviews have been appeared in Journal of South Asian History and Culture, Pacific Affairs, Circus and Society, Scroll, Frontline, the India Forum, and the Book Review. For the discussion of this talk, we have Abhijeet Sapkale with us. He is a PhD candidate from the Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. His thesis title is Language, Borders and State, a case study of Belgaum since the 1960s. His area of interest lies in identities, language, politics, and ideologies, caste, social justice, and social movements. He is also activist and active in student politics and fighting for social justice. So now I would like to invite Suraj to speak and share his journey about this idea of writing, how he came across with this idea of writing this article. And before going to that, if he would be express and share his experience, how this public sphere and the print public sphere become the site of anti-caste consciousness. So that would be grateful for us, since this platform is mostly for the young researchers, those who like us, who are now in the process of training to of learning. So now I would like to invite Suraj. Now, Suraj, you can speak around 30 to 40 minutes. Then Abhijit will come and he will give his comments. Then we'll have Q&A session. Yeah, thank you, Suraj.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ganesh. Am I audible firstly?
Yes, yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Ganesh. Thank you, Abhijit. Thank you, everyone who's associated with Speaking from Margin. This is wonderful to be here. I've heard a lot of things about Speaking from Margin, and I'm really glad to be a part of this initiative. And I hope to sort of continue being a part of this in future as well. I was a bit nervous. I mean, when Ganesh was basically talking about or reeling off all those names who have spoken on this platform. I was wondering what I'm doing here in that sense. But anyway, I mean, we are stuck with this, so we can persist with this for some time at least. So I'll just start off with very briefly telling you about maybe my work. As Ganesh said, my title was Towards a Non-Brahmin Hinduism, Caste Dharma and the Marathi Public Sphere. I worked from roughly the 1890s to the 1930s. This is the period after Jyotirao Phule. So Phule died in 1890. And my curiosity basically began with a very basic question about how can we make sense of Phule's legacy. What can we make of the movement, the Satyashodak movement after 1890s? What were the kind of writings that were emerging from the movement? Who were the writers involved with the movement? And ultimately, what did their writings sort of contribute, or how did their writings shape the public sphere or the idea of the public sphere of that period? And I thought that period was interesting because it's almost like a transition period between Phule and Ambedkar. So Phule died in 1890, as I said. Ambedkar becomes this mass sort of icon from the early 1930s. And we don't really have much of an idea as to what happened between this period. Uh, there are, of course, conjectures. There are, of course, stories about how the movement died after Pule. There wasn't much in terms of social reform activities or even writings as such after Pule. So, how everything basically gradually declined. That's one of the popular sort of assumptions. Another sort of popular assumption is that once the movement began in the 1870s and 80s, it almost always has a teleological sort of story about here is a movement that emerged, did some work, and then it culminated into a non-Brahmin party in the 1920s, and it declined after that. So again, there's this another very simplistic sort of binary that gets painted, I feel, of a movement and a party. But then I feel beyond this, there's a lot to talk about in terms of how can we make sense of the role of the print sphere as such that was not just emerging in a very limited sense, but it was blossoming not just in Western Maharashtra, but all of Maharashtra that we know of today, including rural Maharashtra. And I came across a lot of writings from urban Maharashtra, from rural Maharashtra, from people belonging to all kinds of caste community groups as such. People coming from Phule's caste community, who was a Mari, but also people coming from different, what we can now call as intermediate caste community groups. So we're talking about broadly the Shudra community. Um, and that was what I was interested in roughly, because most of the people that I worked on happened to be from intermediate caste community groups. So I thought I should probably try and focus on their writings. Um, and and I think what I'll try and do now is basically give a very sort of brief overview of what are the sort of interesting things that I thought during my sort of research on this particular topic. And maybe give you a couple of specific examples towards the end, just to give you a sense of this idea of the popular print public, or how do we make sense of the anti-caste consciousness after Jyotirao Phule. So how do we make sense of that legacy, and what are the sort of tensions with that? What are the sort of new sort of discourses that are emerging from that, so on and so forth. So this story basically begins in the late 19th century, as I said. If we have to think about the rise of the print sphere as such, as far as non-Brahmins are concerned, we can think about the period from the 1870s in Western India. We're talking about this specific person called Krishnarao Bhalekar. Bhalekar started his newspaper called Deen Bandhu, oppressed, brother of the oppressed, in 1877. And after him, his son Mukundrao Patil started another newspaper called Deenamitra, which is Friend of the Poor, and he started that newspaper in 1910, and he ran that newspaper up until 1967. So we are essentially talking about one family running a couple of newspapers for almost 100 years, spanning colonial and post-colonial periods, right? So this in itself, I thought, was a very sort of interesting example to delve into, to dive into, to pursue, to see what were they writing, what were they interested in. Were they at all interested in talking about the core issues of Jyotirao Phule, of what he sort of said in his own writings, or were they also trying to talk about some different things? Um, and it's an interesting period because, as I said, Bhalekar starts this newspaper in 1877. It's the first Satyashodhak newspaper, the first non-Brahmin newspaper, if you will, of the movement. And that in itself is interesting because before that, it's not like we didn't have non-Brahmin writers. There were writers who were writing sporadically. But I think the interesting part from the 1870s is this, that we start seeing a blossoming of the print sphere in terms of new newspapers, journals, books and booklets, all of these coming through from various communities all across Maharashtra. So it's almost like non-Brahmins are in some sense latecomers to the print technology, to the print sphere in this time as such. And before them, there was mostly upper class Brahmins who were writing, who were publishing, and all of that, right? Uh, so from the 1870s, we're basically talking about this gradual rise of non-Brahmin newspapers and journals. That's one basic point that we need to keep in mind. Second important thing is, as I said, even if people were writing before the 1870s, what is happening after 1870s is that there is a regular dissemination of newspapers, journals, books, booklets. So non-Brahmin writers are making sure that they are getting in touch with their audience almost on a weekly basis or a fortnightly basis. So this is starting to happen on a regular basis since the 1870s. Um, and what is the nature of these newspapers? How did these newspapers look? What is the content of these journals? The interesting thing is, I feel the first thing that we need to keep in mind is that even when we're talking about these print material as newspapers, they're not newspapers in the sense that we know newspapers as of today. So we're not talking about newspapers who are just letting people know that this is what's happening in the world as such. Their primary motive is basically to act as opinion papers. So even if they're newspapers, they're opinion papers. What do I mean by that? I'm basically talking about newspapers run by maximum just one or two people. So think about a newspaper with 8, 9, 10 pages, which has a column or a couple of pages on opinions, a couple of pages on serialized accounts of novels, short stories, all of that. Think about translations from different texts or translations from different newspapers. So all these different types of writings are getting printed in this 8 to 9 page newspaper, and it is all being run by just one person. So think about Mukundrao Patil, think about Bhalekar running this newspaper enterprise almost single-handedly. They don't have any writers as such. And if you look at the content, it's not about reflecting on what's happening in the world. It's more about trying to generate a new discourse around specifically three things, I feel. One is anti-casteism, one is anti-Brahminism, and third is, of course, related to both these things, which is Hinduism. So, what do these people think about caste, religion, and Brahminism? Is the basic thing why these newspapers basically came into existence. So these people felt that as they're getting access to print technology for the first time in the 1870s, let's try and make use of the print technology by starting our own newspapers, starting our own journals, and creating a discourse through opinions, through writings, and letting people know that this is what they should be aware of. as far as these three themes are concerned, right? So that's one. The second thing is, as I said, I mean, these people, Bhalekar, Mukundrao Patil, they're interesting because um, they're at some level they're semi-literate, they're self-taught, they're not literate people as such. Mukundra Patil was a second-class dropout, for example. So it's interesting that they saw to it that even if they themselves are quote unquote illiterate, they're trying to make use of the print sphere because they know the reach and the scope of the newspapers and the impact it could have on multiple people in different parts of Maharashtra, for example. So even if they themselves were illiterate, and even if they knew this for sure, that we're talking about spectacular illiteracy in Maharashtra at that time, of course, in any part of colonial India for that matter. So we're talking about single digit literacy rates. We're not talking about many people who are literate enough to even read these newspapers. So perhaps what is happening is, of course, when Bhalekar is writing, when Mukundra Patil is writing, most of these writings are also being read out aloud in public domains, in public spaces. So think about your chalks, your chauras, all those things, all those spaces in the public domain where people are just coming and reading out certain sections of newspapers. So that is very much happening. So even if people can't read it, they can most certainly listen to them and try and understand what's being written in these newspapers. And this is not started by Bhalekar or Mukundra Patil. This is very much started by Phule himself. So Phule, for example, there are examples in like the existing literature which talk about how Phule read out certain sections of his own books in certain places. Like, for example, he's reading out Cultivator's Whipcord, sections of Cultivator's Whipcord in Kamatipura in Mumbai, for example. So you can just try and understand similar things happening in different parts of Maharashtra and how regular, ordinary, everyday people are basically getting to know what these newspapers are talking about, what is this discourse that is being created by the Satyashodhak writers, and how could they understand and contribute to this discourse. So that is one way of which by which popular print publics are getting formed. Um, um, Another thing about the content of these newspapers could be how, as I said, I mean, they're also publishing serialized accounts of novels, short stories. So it's not just about opinion pieces. You're also having different genres of writings being published in the newspaper as such. So, newspaper, interestingly, the site of the newspaper is becoming a repertoire of different genres of writing. So even that is something very interesting. And we'll talk more about not just the content, but even the language or the writing style of these newspapers, which I feel is very interesting. Um, and one reason why this is interesting is because, say, for example, these people are writing in these newspapers, they're not just writing in these newspapers and publishing these newspapers, but they're also simultaneously publishing books and booklets of the same content. So, for example, if I'm a writer, if I'm Balekar, if I'm Mukundra Patil, I'm writing in these newspapers, but at the same time, I'm also seeing to it that I also publish the same content in booklets, in books, in different forms, even in performative sort of genres. For example, if I'm writing poetic compositions in Bhalekar's newspaper or Patil's newspaper, I'm using those poetic compositions to also see to it that performers who are performing street theater, for example, they are also using those compositions. So again, compositions are getting published in booklets in that form, for example. So what this does is how the same content is getting reprinted, printed regularly at different time periods, and how this allows the Satyashodhak writers to basically keep their discourse alive and ticking every now and then. Because if something is getting published in the newspaper, it will get published in the newspaper in a week, people will talk about it, and could possibly forget about it, right? But that's not happening because a lot of this material is getting printed and reprinted regularly in different forms, not just in print, but also in the performances as such. So that is something which we should think more about in terms of how a particular discourse is getting reproduced through different channels of communication. And I think this is important again because it sort of facilitates the rise of popular print public on a sort of regular level as such, right? Um, What is the content of this text? Again, one of the things which is interesting and which needs to be kept in mind is how, as I said, their idea of expressing themselves is basically related to these three themes: caste, religion, and Brahminism. But very specifically, they're talking about their immediate historical context. So, for example, if these people were writing in the 1870s and 1880s, their primary concern is, of course, I mean, they're talking about or against Brahmins who are in positions of power and who have always been in positions of power. But they're not really talking about Brahminism in a very abstract, amorphous sense. They're not talking about how Brahminism used to be in the ancient times and how we have always been historically sort of suppressed and so on and so forth. Of course, that's happening, but they want to anchor that suppression in a particular period, in a particular episode, or even in particular people as such. So, which are these episodes? Which are these people? One episode or one period as such, which is extremely important for non-Brahmins writing in this period, is the period of the Peshwas. So the Peshwas who governed Maharashtra in the 18th century, who were the rulers of Maharashtra in the 18th century, they were mostly Brahmins. They were mostly Chitpavan Brahmins. Chitpavan Brahmins being Brahmins coming from Western Maharashtra, who are historically seen as people who've held positions of power. And these are the people against whom non-Brahmins are writing. They would basically say that this is how our lives were under the Peshwas, and we need to confront the Peshwa power even in today's times. Even if the Peshwa is no more, we have the Peshwa power lingering on in everyday spaces through certain people, through certain Brahmins. And one set of people who they are completely against is basically people like Lokmanya Tilak. So Tilak becomes that face of this Chitpavan Brahmin hegemony or this Peshwa hegemony, if you will, which has been continuing since the 18th century. And you see a lot of these non-Brahmin writers, whenever they're talking or whenever they're writing against Brahminism, they're basically talking about what are the things people like Tilak doing, what are the things people like Chiplunkar are doing. Vishnu Shastri Chiplunkar is this uh, remarkably sort of popular figure in the 19th century when it comes to Marathi literary scene as such. So both these figures are Chitpavan Brahmins, but they happen to be the faces of Brahminism against which these people are writing, right? So anything they write, anything they say becomes something to be criticized vigorously, vehemently, right? Um, we'll come to a few examples and I'll talk about how they come into certain examples and certain writings of these people, right? Um, before that, just to give some more sort of broader sort of points, another point which I think which we should all keep in mind is this period, 1890s to the 1930s, roughly, is seeing this boom, as I said, of the print sphere as such. And to put that into perspective, there are a couple of sources which talk about how there were actually 60 to 70 newspapers which were started in this period. So we're talking about non-Brahmin starting roughly around 60 newspapers in this period. So that's roughly the range that we're talking about. We're talking about vernacular Marathi newspapers, right, coming from all across Maharashtra. And these papers are interesting because, as I said, they're not just coming from Western Maharashtra. We're talking about newspapers coming from Kolhapur, from Southern Maharashtra. We're talking about papers coming from Latur, from present day Vidarbha areas. We're even talking about newspapers coming from Baroda, from present day Gujarat. So we're talking about newspapers coming from all across Maharashtra, right? Again, started by not just quote unquote lower caste communities, but also started by socially upward communities coming from your intermediate caste community groups as such. But one thing that is extremely sort of central and common to all these newspapers is, of course, as I said, their strong antipathy against Brahminism. And this point is interesting because, yes, it is generating the rise of new print popular publics as such. But what this anti-Brahminism thing is doing is it is also having some kind of impact, a tangible impact on the anti-caste consciousness that's emerging in Western India. So if we associate anti-caste consciousness with Jyotirao Phule generally, after Jyotirao Phule's period, there is this tension, if you will, between the rise of anti-Brahminism and the rise of anti-caste consciousness. Now, firstly, they're not necessarily two different things. Of course, I mean, they can coexist, they can complement each other. But there were also times when anti-Brahminism as a discourse was getting more and more sort of reified, more and more popular, as opposed to anti-caste consciousness. And we can talk more about this in terms of what happens if anti-Brahminism becomes more prominent and what kind of negative impact, if you will, it could have on anti-caste consciousness. Because if anti-Brahminism becomes the main framework with which people are operating, with which people are writing, it's not necessary that they're even talking about anti-caste consciousness in the same with the same rigor as such, as opposed to anti-Brahminism. So we can talk more about that, and if people have more questions, we can certainly talk about that later on. Um, Another context-specific point, which is extremely important, is 1870s, 1880s. If this is the period when non-Brahmins are writing, they feel that they are able to write all of this. They are able to access print technology and write whatever they would want to write because it has been made possible to them by the Britishers. So the incoming of print technology and the facilitating of print technology by the democratization of Britishers in terms of how education should be available to everyone is something that is very well sort of received by non-Brahmins. And this is interesting because generally when we think about colonial India, we think about this broader binary of colonizers and the colonized. We think about how the Britishers are the colonizers, the rest of the people are colonized. That's the sort of relationship or hierarchy that we talk about. But we never really talk about the diversity of views and opinions vis-a-vis British rule within the colonized. So when we think about how Brahmins were thinking about the British rule, how non-Brahmins were thinking about British rule, I think it's a different picture altogether, right? And most of these non-Brahmins, in all their writings, be it poetic compositions, be it any kind of speech, be it any kind of editorial, in all these different genres of writings, you could see many non-Brahmin writers are actually praising British rule because they have helped them get access to print technology, because they've helped them get access to modern institutes of education, and this happens a lot even up until, say, the 1930s. So we're talking about as late as the 1930s, where people are still talking in terms of how we would continue to revere the British rule until and unless the sun stops coming in the sky, and so on and so forth. So we're talking about that kind of high praise for British, right? It's almost like if they had not come, there would have been no meaning to their lives. They would never have been able to express themselves through the writings, through education. They would have never been able to have that kind of political consciousness that we're talking about. So, singularly, they almost see to it that British rule has to get some kind of praise, right, for that, which is again interesting. And I don't think many people talk about this and like different aspects of facets of this relationship of Britishers and non-Brahmins. Again, we can talk about it if people are more interested in it. We can definitely talk about it. Um, Maybe I can come back to all of these things again when we talk about these things, but I'll just give two examples in some detail about the things that I came across in my research. One is, as I said, this example of Bhalekar and Mukundarao Patil, almost being the first family of Satyashodak writers who came up with this newspaper revolution. Uh, we're talking about how, especially Mukundarao Patil's paper, Din Mitra, Friend of the Poor, along with it publishing different serialized accounts, as I said, of novels, short stories, there was one interesting thing that they did. They had a vibrant letters to the editor section. And this is something that I've written in my recently sort of published article. Uh, Letters to the editor, as we again see of in today's newspapers, it's obviously a column where everyday readers express their opinions, views about what do they feel about what's happening in the world, right? And with Deen Mitra, I feel it's almost like the start of everyday, ordinary non-Brahmins talking about what do they feel about religion, what do they feel about caste, what do they feel about Brahminism. So it's almost like the start of how everyday readers are not just passive consumers of whatever these Satyashodak writers are saying about caste, religion, Brahminism, but they're also sort of active agents in contributing to this particular discourse around these three themes. And we see that in a lot of examples about how everyday readers coming from rural Maharashtra, for example, are talking about some local Brahmin priest and what he's doing, or some local discourse that is getting created around religion, for example, some Dalit household talking about are they at all part of Hinduism, for example. All these debates, all these interesting local, everyday sort of things are getting expressed through letters to the editor. And I feel letters to the editor, again, is a section which is terribly underused by archival sort of researchers, because people don't work on letters to the editors. Even when people work on newspapers as archives, we normally tend to focus on editorials or the first pages, or even these days, advertisements, which are, of course, extremely important. But I think if we have to get a sense of how everyday people were reacting to what these people were writing, I think it's extremely important to look at letters to the editors. Perhaps that's the only place where we could get at least some sense of what these people were saying and what these people were exactly feeling about these three things. Um, Related to this thing, there's again another popular perception that most of these Satyashodak writers or most of these readers, even everyday readers, they were basically partaking in how in partaking in Brahmin hatred or Brahmin bashing. That's the popular perception. Of course, that was happening, but it's almost, in some sense, a reductive understanding of their own sort of take on Brahmin hegemony or what is Brahminism. So we can't reduce everyday writers and these writers to that level of how there was just Brahmin hatred that was going on. They were just mocking them or ridiculing them. That's not what was happening. They were actually using that moment, which was given to them by the incoming of print technology, to actually channelize their hatred into creating some kind of an expository resource to talk about Brahminism. So what are the different ways in which they could comprehend Brahminism, different facets of Brahminism? So ritualistic aspect, social aspect, cultural aspect. So it's a much more complex, nuanced sort of position that even everyday readers are taking. So it's not just random bashing of Brahmins that's happening, right? And that again is something interesting, I feel, because here again we're talking about largely people who are unlettered, who had no access to institutional sort of modern educational institutes as such, but they're still very much interested in expressing extremely sort of complex views on religion and Brahminism. So that is again something that we can keep thinking about. Another thing that's happening with these popular print publics, these sort of everyday readers, is that they're not taking pride in their local or very specific caste identity as such. That's what I feel. Why do I say that? Because one of the things that is happening is because is how when they're writing these letters to the editor, they're basically making use of anonymous sort of identities. So anonymity is an extremely interesting strategic tool that is being deployed by everyday readers to basically express themselves in these newspapers. So if you look at these letters, at the end of the letter, you'll see the name of the person who's written the letter, but you'll also see the designation of that person. And that designation is almost always a pseudonym. So the person would identify himself as a wandering preacher, as an oppressed farmer, as a subscriber, as someone who's oppressed in the household as such. So it'll always be slightly more abstract and amorphous. That's one way of looking at it. But I think another way of looking at it would be how they're strategically sort of talking about the identities of farmers, peasants, subscribers, which is helping them actually to transcend the deeper segmentations within Bahujan community. So if you think about it, at some level, this anti-caste consciousness project is a binary project of Brahmins and non-Brahmins, right? And if you're talking about non-Brahmins, we're essentially talking about 90-95% of the population. But obviously, even within that 95%, you can't just lump everyone under this one category, one umbrella category of non-Brahmins. There are going to be segmentations, tensions within this umbrella category, right? So, what are the ways by which you could try and transcend these boundaries or these tensions or these hurdles? One of the ways by which you could do that is by trying to popularize certain identities, certain categories, which have a wider resonance across the social and cultural sort of spectrum of Maharashtra. So you can talk about the identity of a farmer, you can talk about the identity of a peasant, You can use the category of Bahujan, but you can also use slightly expansive categories of a subscriber, of a reader, of a wandering preacher, which could have a deeper sort of solidarity network connection element to it, right? And not instead of talking about your own specific identity and almost like reifying them through letters of editors, right? So again, that is something important because it helps build or expand the contours of your popular print public. It doesn't remain a public specified only to a particular caste community as such, or a cluster of caste communities. It moves much beyond that, right? Um, about another thing which I felt was interesting is again how are these newspapers, how are these vernacular print spheres talking about the question of women, for example, the women question, for example. Uh, and I found that interesting because my assumption was that if they are talking about caste, perhaps everything other than caste would get subsumed under caste, right? So caste would become that meta category, other things would get subsumed under caste, so on and so forth. But to my surprise, that's not what's happening. Especially Mukundra Patil in his Deen Mitra newspaper, he is basically very much giving space to everyday women to let them express their own private grievances in the public sort of domain as such, right? So if you look at these letters to the editor, he's very much giving at least a page, if not 2 pages, almost every week to these everyday women to express their private grievances against their estranged sort of relationship with their husbands. So, and I found this interesting because Mukundra Patil could have said that, okay, I mean, we don't need to talk about the women question because ultimately it's going to prove as some kind of a hurdle to our main question, which is the caste question. So let's not complicate matters. Let's just stick to caste. Let's not think about other things which could derail our anti-caste movement as such. So he's not thinking along those lines. He's very much thinking about how gender is very much a core part of this caste question. And he's also trying to see everyday women as core sort of actors in this project of anti-caste consciousness. So again, that's something interesting, I thought, and we can again talk something more about that in terms of how are they writing these letters, what's the content of these letters as such. Are they even talking about other things? Like, are they just restricting themselves to private matters, or are they even talking about public matters as such? Right. So all those things we can talk more about that. Another interesting, I think, element is the actual language being used. Another sort of very quick anecdote, perhaps, or a quick insight on that would be in Marathi. So at that time, 18th century, 19th century, there was this script called the Modi script. So Modi was used at in the 18th century, and if you look at Modi, it's very difficult to sort of read, comprehend. There are no sort of gaps in the middle as such, so you feel like you're reading one straight line as such, and there are no. It's not readable. It's not accessible, and there's an interesting take on how non-Brahmins actually favored Barbod. Barbod was this second script over the Modi script. So Modi's script was more and more sort of getting related to, if you will, to the Brahmins, and Barbod was almost seen as the non-Brahmin script. And why is this the case? Because Modi was identified for its inscrutability, for its general inefficiency, for how it's extremely difficult to read, as I said. And as opposed to that, Barbod was seen as a language which was much more readable, much more accessible. It had sort of clear gaps in the middle. It saw to it that uh, it sort of almost gave an equal treatment to each and every word. So that's how it was perceived. So in that sense, there is a democratic sort of element attached to it in terms of how there's a democratic egalitarian way of giving each and every word its due. And this was very interestingly formulated or pushed forth by Chhatrapati Shahu. So Shahu was this princely ruler of Kolhapur, and Shahu was very much this champion of non-Brahmin issues and concerns. And one of the things that he did was championing the Barbod script. So he issued an ordinance in 1917, and he almost said it in so many words that Barbod is basically the language or the script of the non-Brahmins. And this is exactly what even people like Mukundra Patil and others do in their own sort of communications, if you will, with the everyday leader. So Mukundrao Patil, for example, would write certain pedagogical ordinances in his newspaper itself, wherein he'll tell the readers that, look, you don't have to use Modi because of these reasons, and start using Barbod because of these reasons. So, how even certain language scripts are then getting associated with certain caste clusters as such of what belongs to Brahmins and what belongs to non-Brahmins, right? So that is again something that we can think about. Um, Ganesh, how are we doing with time? You're on mute.
Time, yeah. You can speak more 5 to 7 minutes
Okay,
if you.
okay. Maybe I can just give one more example of the writing style per se of another person, perhaps, and then we can open it up. There was another person that I worked on for my thesis. There's this remarkable person called Dinkar Rao Zawalkar. Zawalkar was this fiery sort of writer, orator in the 1920s, very much a staunch sort of Satyashodak writer as such. But he was interesting because, as opposed to other Satyashodak writers, he made prodigious use of what could broadly be called as inflammatory rhetoric. So his writing, if you see it in Marathi, it's extremely inflammatory. It's filled with cuss words, invectives, slurs, slang, whatever you would like to call it as. And he's basically just lambasting Brahmins left, right, and center, right? And one of them being, of course, Lokmanya Tilak, who almost epitomizes, as I said, this Brahmin hegemony as such historically. Uh, and I think there are three things over here. I mean, his writing style, and how his writing style is basically confronting this political project of language standardization that was happening in the early 20th century. So, what do I mean by that? So, his writing style was basically not bound by unnatural stops and gaps in grammar and syntax. Uh, so his writing style defied formally writerly rules and regulations. Um, his emotive outbursts was almost like a response to the codification of language or the standardization of language. So there were no subsections, there was no thematic layout, there was no structure to the writing as such. His understanding of dealing with themes and issues almost always shuttled back and forth in time. So there was no sort of template according to which he was writing, right? So that in itself was a revolt against standardization, codification of how Marathi should be written and spoken, right? And another thing, of course, as I said, if he is using inflammatory rhetoric, he's very much deploying a lot of demeaning neologisms. So he's coming up with new words, new terms, new concepts to basically, again, do a lot of mocking and ridiculing of Brahmins. So that's definitely what is happening. Second thing, as I said, was resisting or confronting this language standardization drive. So what was happening in the 19th century? There were a lot of Brahmins, especially a lot of Brahmin grammarians, like this person called R.B. Gunjikar, for example, who was basically uh, almost forcing people to talk about how we should all come together and talk about one stable, pure Marathi language as such. And we shouldn't be celebrating different forms of Marathi or different registers of Marathi, right? And how we should all come together. We should all give up our pride in the local forms or sub languages of Marathi, and we should talk about or almost like submit ourselves to this to this stable Marathi language. And I think people like Zawalkar were its strongest sort of critiques because of their writing style, because of how they believed in actually making use of a lot of neologisms. As I said, they didn't write according to certain rules, grammar, and syntax, and all of that. And I feel if you read Zawalkar's writings, he's operating somewhere in the middle of writing as a print text and as an oral speech. In the sense that if you read his writing, it almost feels like this particular writing was meant to be addressed to a mass sort of audience as such. So it's basically an oral speech which is being published in the form of the text per se. And his writing, you feel that he's constantly shuttling between print text and oral speech, right? And that again is some kind of a revolt to how writings should be done and so on and so forth, right? And another thing related to that is how it is difficult to discipline spoken tongue as opposed to written word. So people like Zawalkar had like an instant connect and an instant resonance among masses because, of course, he's writing in a language which people know best, right? Because it includes spoken tongue, because it includes that spoken tongue obviously has that malleability. It can have different forms and textures to how it's spoken. It is much more abstract. It is not facing the problem of the indelibility of the written word, which is much more easier to discipline, right? So, spoken tongue largely remained outside this disciplining process of standardization that I'm talking about. And because it largely remains outside this disciplining process, of course, people like Javalkar made full use of that to basically connect to masses in a more direct sense, in the language in which they were speaking, basically, right? And he was doing that not just through writings, but he was also doing that through composing certain poetic compositions for what he called Chhatrapati Melas. So, Melas were basically this form of street theater. Think about, I mean, some form of Nukkad Natak that happens in Delhi, for example. Something along those lines, which was, these Melas were basically short yet edgy metrical compositions, which were basically pouring scorn on Tilak, right? So it was just basically extremely critical of Tilak. And think about poetic compositions which were just completely bashing Tilak and uh, bashing his idea of the Ganpati Melas, for example. So that's what it's coming up against. So if you think about Tilak and starting who started this Ganesh festival, Chitrapati Melas are something which are coming almost as a counter to the Ganpati Melas, right? And I think this is interesting because when we think about the performative sphere and when we think about the print sphere, again, there's this tendency among some scholars to look at these two spheres differently. But we need to think about them in unison because one is necessarily complementing the other. Because whatever is being written in print, as I said, is also being used by the performative sphere, right? And this is most certainly happening in the mailers, right? And so to see Chhatrapati Melas as some kind of everyday street polemics is, I think, something which we can think more about, which is making use of not just the performative element, but also making use of the print text as such, right? Um, I think with that, I can stop perhaps, and maybe we can have all kinds of questions, queries, concerns uh, with whatever I've spoken, or maybe even apart from that.
Yeah, thank you, Suraj, for this fantastic and brilliant information, and also the way how can we also know about the anti-caste public sphere as well as this print in a very vernacular sense, we can say. Now I would like to invite Abhijeet for his comment. Then we'll begin the question and answer session.
Thank you, Suraj, for such a wonderful talk, and thank you, Ganesh, for giving me the opportunity to talk. Basically, I was going through this paper, and I could find some of the very strong points that you have, like for example, taking Deen Mitra, and within that also taking up specifically the letters, which is a very new way to look totally towards how discursive spaces are being created or discursive spaces were created within the non-Brahmin public. So that was something which was very interesting. The conceptual reframing of readership which you have done, that is, I felt that it is something of a like going from a top-down approach. It's rather opposing it, and it's going from how the public themselves uh, contributed to this discursive space. One more aspect which I looked at was the anonymity, and I would love to know more how this, uh, if you could elaborate more on this anonymity wala aspect, and how all this names, Ek Prekshak, Apla Jat Bandhu, etc., and or Firta Upadeshak, how were these nomenclature used by the editor themselves, or were these used by the public themselves? So this is one point which I want to know more. And or is it a way to know how these names came up? Uh,
Mhm.
the recovery of female voices was also something which and I also was looking at how you talk about one of the two aspects. One is the female voices, and the other is the internal nuances among the communities. Uh, in that aspect, I would also like to know one point where you highlight how editor would also intervene uh, at some point of time when there were discussions on untouchability or intercommunity tensions. They would intervene, and that was something which was interesting to me. Uh, One of the point which I would also like to know that since you're working from 1890s to 1920s roughly, uh, at the same time we could see also Dr. B.R. Ambedkar starting his own newspapers roughly around 1920s and all. How did these newspaper communicated with Dr. Ambedkar's movement? Because as of now, what I have understood is there were communication, but we don't have exactly how they communicate. We don't know exactly how they communicated. That is something which I'm interested in knowing. Also, one of the thing which I would uh, like to know that you spoke about Dinkar Rao Zawarkar and the famous text Deshache Dushman, uh, which was written by J.D.N. Zawarkar, for which Dr. Ambedkar fought the case. There is this specific terminology called Tidkat Lele, which is being used. So now, when we convert that terminology Tidkat Lele in English, uh, so that becomes Tilakites or something which loses the essence of the word. So how do you grapple with that problem? That is one of my question. When you're converting a Marathi term into an English terminology, how do you grapple with those, the essence of it? That is something which I would like to know. Also, I would like to know about, for example, my fieldwork is Belgaum, and Belgaum also had uh, Satyashodak Press, that was Satyashodak Print Public, that was uh, Rashtraveer. And Rashtraveer is still working on the ground level. Rashtraveer still publishes fortnightly. So, how these editors, the editors of Rashtraveer or the editors of Deen Mitra, were communicating amongst themselves? Yeah.
Mhm. Mhm. Okay, wow. Too many questions, extremely
Yeah.
interesting questions. What do we do, Ganesh? Should I just try and answer them, or should I collect some more? Uh,
Uh,
or
it's up to you, whatever you are
okay, I
convenient.
can maybe, because there are like 3 or 4 questions, we can maybe answer. We can maybe talk about Abhijit's first, and then
Yeah,
uh,
yeah,
some more
yeah,
questions.
yeah.
Um, Okay, so with anonymity, so it's basically it's not the editor who's understanding these people as a wandering preacher or or an oppressed farmer. It's basically them who are basically identifying themselves. The people are identifying themselves as an oppressed farmer. So Ganslela Shetkari. So that's how they are identifying themselves. So it's the people who are doing the identification. And I think, I mean, of course, there are multiple ways by which we could try and understand this, but I think this understanding is crucial, I feel, to how perhaps we could understand it, which is they're trying to uh, reach out to more and more people from their own caste clusters or even beyond their caste clusters as such to create some kind of a universal language for non-Brahmins to respond and react. Because if you don't do that, then you're just basically a Mali person or some other person. Then you're just basically talking about or responding to people from those caste communities. So that's my understanding of it, and that's how I thought. I mean, they were trying to address people, right? Uh, and even with Updeshaks, for example, Updeshaks being preachers, I think, I mean, Updeshaks were interesting because here are a group of people who um, were not just responding to what Deen Mitra was asking them or contributing to Deen Mitra. Updeshaks were also people who were voluntarily going to different villages in Maharashtra And they were basically carrying forward the message of the Satyashodak movement. So we're talking about a voluntary group of people who were just doing this voluntary work of going to villages, setting up conferences, local meetings, interacting with local people, basically letting them know what the Satyashodak movement is all about. All those things is what the Udeshaks are doing. I think there's more work sort of need to be done about these people as such, as to why are they doing it, how are they doing it, what is the sort of logistical sort of thing that's going around with all of that. So how are they sort of managing to do this on a consistent basis? Because you see this happening from the 1910s, 20s, 30s on a regular basis, right? But I think that could be a short sort of answer to your thing on anonymity and Updeshaks. Um, the editor would intervene for sure, especially when he would feel, again, this is my understanding, especially when he would feel that there are some people who are perhaps needlessly complicating the discourse, who are trying to sort of create certain hurdles between maybe Dalits and Shudras, for example. If there is some discourse that is getting created about Dalits and about their sort of Christian proclivity, if you will, or about their eating dietary habits, if you will. So if the editor is feeling that, okay, this is what's happening, so he would intervene and say that, no, this is my understanding of the issue, and this is what I feel Dalits are talking about. So other readers should take a note of this. So this is what he's doing. So he's very much aware of the fact that there is a point beyond which things could go ugly. Things could sort of, it could just create certain, I mean, tensions between different communities. So he obviously doesn't want that to happen. And he's very much aware as an editor in that sense. So I came across like many examples of this kind where he is very much trying to tell people that, okay, uh, maybe whatever your perception has been of the thing that I've got published, it's not, we shouldn't understand these things in that manner. This is my understanding, and this is what I feel these people are talking about. So I feel, I mean, again, he was more of a active, perceptive sort of an editor, and not just someone who's just focusing on some caste communities and giving only them the platform to talk and publish, right? Um, a relationship with Ambedkar is interesting. It's very interesting because, again, I've been thinking about this. I've been trying to work on this. Uh, at some level, Ambedkar is having major issues with the non-Brahmin party. So he is becoming extremely critical of people associated with the non-Brahmin party in the 1920s for obvious reasons. One of them being something which is as basic or as fundamental as how non-Brahmins, according to Ambedkar, are basically imitating Brahmins. So they're just becoming like Brahmins. They're not basically sticking to their radical school of thought, which belonged to Phule, or which, I mean, they should be talking about that much more radically, but they're not doing that. And they're moving away from that and they're just imitating Brahmins. So he's extremely sort of frustrated with this lot of non-Brahmins, if you will, right? But at the same time, he's of course extremely sort of perceptive again about people who are writing, who are trying to create a discourse about certain non-Brahmin issues. As you just mentioned, I mean, Kesh, Jede, Javalkar, I mean, these are the people that he obviously would know about. He would know about their radical school of thought. He would certainly support them as such. If you think about the Mahad Satyagraha, for example, in 1927, there are quite a few non-Brahmins associated with the Satyashodak movement who are participating in Mahad Satyagraha. So they are very much having very good relations with Ambedkar. But I think this is the broad distinction that we need to make. I think there are many Ambedkar having major issues with the party, but he's also sort of working very closely with certain people, with certain non-Brahmins. Um, I've not really come across many newspapers, many non-Brahmin Satyashodak newspapers, which are very specifically or directly talking about Ambedkar's newspapers as such. But I think I need to sort of do a bit more digging up on that, especially on maybe if Ambedkar is talking something about non-Brahmins in Muknayak, for example, in the 1920s. So he could well possibly be doing that. But one thing that's happening is, for sure, that's happening is how all these newspapers, Ambedkar newspapers and Satyashodak newspapers, they are definitely publishing excerpts from different newspapers. So if they feel that there is some event or incident that's happened and that's been covered by some newspaper, and if they feel that that is very much aligning to their political sort of ideology, they would certainly uh, have that excerpt and publish them in their newspapers. So, for example, Prabodhankar Thackeray does that. I mean, he would see that he would see to it that there are other non-Brahmin newspapers which are talking about Brahminism, for example, in a critical manner. So he would latch on to that. He would publish it almost verbatim in his editorial opinion columns as such. So that is definitely happening. And as I said, I mean, I think with Ambedkar, we should think more about his personal relationships with these people. I think that is something much more interesting than about his relationship with the movement as such, or with the party as such, right? Tilkat Lele is again something interesting, again something that I've always sort of struggled with, to be very honest. So, for example, I mean, if I have to give out some examples, there are certain examples which Savarkar uses, which are somewhat easier to translate. So, for example, in Deshat Se Dushman, he's using terms like uh, Saitan, Shaitan, devil. Songadia Chor is imposter thief. Gadwache Pore, offspring of donkeys. Darodekhor, national robbers. Uh, Manache Kuchkat, rotten minds. So some of them are perhaps easier to translate. I won't say that all of them are extremely difficult to translate. I think even with this translation, of course, you could argue that it still sort of leaves out a lot of the original sort of zing or sting of the Marathi word as such. But I understand what you're saying. But I think what I try and do is I probably then break the word down into like two or three words or groups as such. Almost try and explain two or three parts of one word. So maybe etymologically or like socioculturally, for example. And in that sense, you at least try and explain what the word is or explain the feeling behind the word, if not translate the word. So, for example, I mean, in some other context, I think in some Mera compositions, Chhatrapati Mera compositions, I think there's a word being used which is Kalundri Gubdauni. So it's almost like Gubdaun being this invocation to the owl, to the and the um and how basically it's anything but beautiful, right? I mean, it's the exact opposite of the concept of beauty as such. But how do you translate the word Gubdaun, for example, in that cultural sense? So it's not just about literal translation of Gubdaun into an owl in the way it looks, right? But it's also you trying to talk about the cultural meaning of the word Gubdaun. So again, I mean, I think it depends on like it depends. It varies from word to word. It depends on the context. It depends on how much do you think the word is central to your own research work as such, and how deeper do you want to go into that word as such. So I think it's context dependent. It depends on how many examples you have, and if you want to connect those examples to a larger sort of discourse as such. So all those things I feel are important. But I take your point, of course. I mean, it's an extremely difficult thing to do. I personally struggle a lot. But I mean, we need to sort of keep thinking about, I guess, different ways of navigating that. Rashtraveer, I forgot. Sorry, what was the question? I mean, is it you said something about the present times as well, and
Yeah, so Rashtraveer is still functioning in Belgaum, and I met some of the people from the Rashtraveer. So I was also
Mhm.
interested in knowing how the editors of these various Satyashodak print newspapers were communicating with each other. Was there any communication between them, or was it just, hmm, yeah?
Yeah, so they were very much communicating with each other. Again, as I said, I mean, one of the things that's very much happening is how excerpts from different newspapers are getting published in different newspapers. So, for example, if we're talking about Vijay Maratha, and if they have published something in Pune, Rashtraveer, if they feel that's important or significant to their project, they will publish it, and so on and so forth. They would certainly talk about each other in terms of advertisements. So that's again something that's happening. So if Prabodhankar Thackeray in his Prabodhan, in his journal, if he is talking about something about Brahminism, and if he feels that Rashtravi is talking about it, if Jagruti in Baroda is talking about it, he would make a point to talk about the newspaper as such. So basically popularizing the newspaper. That look, he would tell his readers that there is a newspaper in Baroda which is also talking the same thing, which is also highlighting the same issues. So go and have a look at the newspaper as well. So they're also making use of each other, helping each other in some sense, to basically almost see them as a part of that Satyashodak constellation, if you will. So they're not seeing themselves as competitors or none of that. So they're almost seeing themselves as colleagues in some sense. Were they friends? Perhaps not, but definitely as colleagues. They're definitely seeing themselves as part of this one constellation, as I said, of Satyashodak thought. So, which is what I thought was interesting. But again, that's something which you could, which I mean, a lot can be done about that. I mean, you can pursue a lot of things in that direction.
Yeah, then now I can ask if whoever having any questions, then you can raise your hand and ask directly. Also, you can write in chat box if you are not comfortable in asking directly through mic. Somebody has written. Are you able to reading this?
Yeah, I'm just reading it. I mean, that's the question, right? I mean, so Akanksha is basically asking if everyone can see this in the chat box. Is it more about how are they basically navigating this idea of a unified non-Brahmin press, of a unified imagined community, or was it a fragmented sort of public? That tension always persisted, as far as I understand it, because at one level they're talking about uh, or they're making use of categories like Shudras, Bahujans, uh, farmers, peasants, workers. So they're making use of all these categories to talk about how whatever we are saying is basically related to all these categories, right? And they're trying to lump all these different categories together under the category of Bahujan, right? But of course, there are also tensions in the sense that some of these Shudras are also trying to project themselves as Kshatriyas. So that's another sort of social sort of development that's happening in late 19th, early 20th century, because people are actually beginning to feel that the Shudra category is more of a negative category. It has a lot of negative connotations as such attached to it. So we should move away from the term Shudra and start talking about other terms. Start talking about Bahujan, but most certainly start talking about the term Kshatriya. It has its own sort of, again, I mean, cultural issues. It's reifying certain caste identities as such. It's certainly not helping the anti-consciousness cause as such ultimately, because then you're talking about different caste community groups trying to, I mean, almost identify themselves as a socially upward mobile community as such, right? So is it the same project of anti-caste consciousness that Pule eventually began with? That's a big question. That's the question that's basically I was trying to work on in my thesis, which is how can we understand the legacy of Pule in some sense? Are we moving away from his legacy, or are we uh, sticking to some of his thoughts or principles, but also trying to talk about different things in a different manner? So I think, I mean, they were trying to talk about a unified, of course, a community, a Marathi speaking community as such. But you see a lot of cracks emerging, especially on specific themes and issues, as I said, like Hinduism. So what does it mean? What does Hinduism mean for non-Brahmin communities? Why is it important to talk about Hinduism for them? Are they talking about Phule's anti-caste consciousness in as radical a manner as Phule himself, along with talking about Hinduism? Or do they want to articulate a different form of Hinduism altogether? And if you're articulating a different form of Hinduism, or if you're saying that our Hinduism is different than Brahminical Hinduism, then it obviously is going to have an impact on this perceived unified imagined community as such, which is getting projected through anti-caste print consciousness. So I think that is still something which we need to work on, need to think about more, I think. But it's a very complicated sort of picture that emerges. It depends on where you are in Maharashtra and which part of Maharashtra you're working on, of course. There's a lot of work that's emerging from Western Maharashtra, but I feel there's so much more to be done in Southern Maharashtra, Vidarbh, rural Maharashtra. What is the discourse that is getting from those from those regions? But I think that's an important question, of course, and I think we should keep thinking about it.
Anamika is raising her hand, so you can ask Anamika.
Hi, Suraj. I am actually a PhD candidate and I work with book history and print culture, specifically focusing on Mumbai and Pune. That's why this talk was quite relevant for me. That's why I have like two questions which I want to ask you. One is more or less a general question. I wanted to know what archival repositories you consulted and visited to write your dissertation. This is more of like a general question that I had. The second question that I wanted to ask you, I wanted to know your views on it. Actually, I wrote my MA thesis in 2024 from JNU, and I was writing on selected periodicals of the 19th century in the Bombay Presidency. I was working specifically with the Bombay Gazette, which was the first newspaper in the presidency. I was looking at the letters to the editor, like the same thing that you were talking about. I was looking at the letters to the editor to frame how the readers responded to the mutiny of 1857. So, given that now some time has passed and I have had some knowledge about how letters to the editors work, I have come across this argument that, at least as far as Anglo-Indian newspapers are considered, a lot of letters to the editor were actually written by the editor. This is what a lot of researchers also come to say. Like the letters to the editor in the 19th century were actually a journalistic genre, and the letters were indeed were written by the editor themselves. And as far as the pseudonyms are concerned, which you were also talking about, so I just wanted to know, like, do you, as a historian, do you take these letters to the editor at their face value? Because again, I mean, there is also a point of censorship, like what gets printed, what does not get printed. Because at the end of the day, the editor selects that this will get printed and this might not get printed. So, and again, like, how do you, as a historian, look at the letters and decide that okay, this is a genuine letter written by a reader, or is it written by the editor themselves? So yeah, that is a complicated question, I think, as a print historian, and we should address it. That's why I thought maybe I should ask your views on it.
Thanks, Anamika, for that. I mean, very interesting questions, of course. I mean, it's again a tricky terrain, as you said, but I do feel that at some point, I mean, we should take these things seriously because, I mean, especially with the newspapers that I looked. I mean, for example, Deen Mitra that I worked on, the letters to the editors from Deen Mitra. Most of these letters are, I mean, if you look at the newspaper, as I said, there are 8 to 9 pages in the newspaper, and letters to the editor comprise around like 1 page or sometimes even 2 pages every week, every fortnight. And we're talking about these letters getting published from the 1910s. I looked at the period till the 1930s, mid 1930s, and I've looked at quite a few letters getting published in this period. And I don't know how one can sort of say for this conclusively that it is the editor who's doing all of this. I mean, to answer your first part of the question, I mean, I get the apprehension behind that in the sense that what if all of this is just being written by or rewritten by the editor or reinterpreted by the editor before it gets published, so on and so forth. But I feel, I mean, if there are multiple letters in front of you, as a researcher, as someone who's trying to make sense of these things, I think we need to take them seriously to begin with because they're coming from different places. Again, if we sort of believe in believe in the designation that okay, this letter is coming from rural Maharashtra, from southern Maharashtra, from different places, we get some information along with that anonymity. So it's not just the anonymous information that is getting published. It is also the information of the place that the letter is coming from. It is also the information of say, for example, the letters that everyday women are writing to these newspapers, they are actually having all the information that you need. I mean, as a reader, I mean, think about, so you're talking about the name of the person, we're talking about the place, we're talking about the period of their estrangement, for example. So if we're talking about everyday women and if they're talking about estranged relationships and their husbands, and their abusive relationship, for example, they're actually also hinting at the time period and the time frame of this particular relationship. So all of this is actually happening on a regular basis. And I don't see the point of not taking them seriously. Because if we don't do that, then what is the other way by which we could try and understand everyday readers? I mean, letters to the editor is perhaps the most important and the only site where we could understand everyday readership or everyday sort of experiences as such. So that is what I would say is something that I would keep relying on. I mean, of course, you could, as a researcher, try and think about, I mean, other things like if there is some sort of similarity in different letters, is one letter reading the same as some other letter? If that's happening, then perhaps you can say that, okay, maybe this is just a copy paste business. It's probably not a genuine letter. It's sounding very similar to what I read previously in the previous week or before that or whatever. But if you are getting a sense of how people are actually talking about very specific things in their own language, with their own sort of colloquial sort of sensibilities in the language per se. So sometimes, even with these letters, I think what these editors are, why these editors are interesting, I feel sometimes, is also because they retain the rusticness of the language, the colloquial words that people use in everyday life. So just because it's getting published in the letters to the editor columns, it's not getting completely quote unquote sanitized as such in a language sense. So if those things are getting retained, I feel there's all the more reason for us to sort of make sense of who the people are, how are they writing, how are they expressing themselves, what is the language being deployed. Um, but I think that's what I would have to say, perhaps. And yeah, I mean, I'll probably think more about this, but it is, I mean, I completely get the tension, the challenge in navigating these things. But I feel, I mean, that's the only thing I mean, we're supposed to do. And we should definitely do that. Instead of, I mean, coming from a position of suspicion, I think we can come from a position of curiosity.
Yeah, so there are two more questions in the chat box, and I think this will be the final two questions since we are running late. Oh, there another one also. No, no, yeah. Two.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Archive question. Anamika also asked that question. So unfortunately, I mean, I was working during the first and the second wave of COVID. So a lot of, I mean, limitations, hurdles in terms of mobility, but even then, I managed to get access to a lot of interesting things. Apart from some places in Pune and Bombay, apart from the usual government institutional archives that we see in Bombay, for example, in Elphinstone College, or in Pune, I went to or had this access to the Mahatma Phule Samta Pratishthan, Baba Adav's archives, who unfortunately recently passed away. So he was extremely generous in giving me access to his archives and his material. I went to Kolhapur. Kolhapur has this university called Shahu University, which has a remarkable sort of repository of not just Kolhapur material per se, but also a lot of other things as well. Uh, I got some material from Latur, from another place in Vidarbh. I didn't manage to go there because of COVID and other things. But as I said, I mean, we've literally sort of starting to scrape through the surface, and there are so many things that we could have an access to if we start looking at these places like Marathwada, Vidarbh, Khandesh, and not many historians, not many archivists go there or work on these regions. I mean, primarily because, of course, one issue is the language barrier as such. Even people working on Marathi issues, so-called Marathi issues, Marathi themes, they don't happen to know the language, which is surprising because that, of course, then entails them to focus only on colonial documents or on English sources or on translations, which are at times extremely shoddy. So I think because, I mean, especially people who know the language, I think that's what we should be doing. I think we should just be traveling as much as possible in all parts of Maharashtra and just try and I mean, almost work as those curious people trying to find new material, almost trying to do it in a more conventional sense of just hunting down sources, archives in obscure places. So that's what I tried doing, but I think that would be a short sort of answer to that. Uh, I think that answers Ravi's question as well. Um, okay, I have a kind of exploratory question in which I want to know some less explored arenas of research in the context of public sphere. Okay. I think Vijay, these are the, I mean, fundamental sort of people that, I mean, you've mentioned. Habermas, of course, Fraser. I would say, I mean, anyone and everyone who's worked on the period after Fraser, like we're talking about the 90s and after that, are all of them have something interesting to say. More than focusing on the Western thinkers or Western writers, I would say try and have a look at people who have worked with the concept of the public sphere in the Indian context. So, for example, there's this writer called Christian Lee Nowitzki, who's worked extensively on vernacularization, on the emergence of the idea of the public sphere in pre-modern India. So he's talking about the rise of the Marathi language as such, and how can we make sense of that vis-a-vis the existing dominant sort of uh, presence of Sanskrit as such. So public sphere, not just in the modern period, but also try and look at how people have understood public sphere in the pre-modern period. Then there are lots of other people who have thought about public sphere in a more anthropological sense as well. You can think of Carol Brickleridge, Arjuna Padurai, of course. Um, then, in a more linguistic sense, I think people have used public sphere, or at least the framework of public sphere, in talking about different language battles or linguistic nationalisms. There's someone who's worked on Maithili in Bihar. I keep forgetting. Um, of course, there's a lot of work in like the Dravidian print sphere. So anything and everything by people like V. Geeta, by A.R. Venkatchalapati, by even the recent sort of companion on Periyar. So there's this Cambridge companion to Periyar which came out recently by Karthik Ram Manoran and A.R. Venkatchalapati. Again, that it has a lot of different like ways in which public sphere gets invoked in that volume. So there are different ways I think by which people have used it, but uh, and I personally feel that is what should be done. I mean, we sometimes tend to rely too much on Western theories, thinkers, frameworks. Of course, they're important, but I think we can't necessarily just use them and just use them exactly in the same manner as how they used it in the Western context. So ultimately, we need to have our own understanding of how popular print publics are emerging, and we need to come up with our own sort of conceptual frameworks and tools. So maybe I mean, broadly suggest that just focus more on recent scholars, recent sort of writers who are trying to make sense of the public sphere, instead of talking about what Habermas was talking about in the 90s, for example. So that doesn't make much sense, at least to me. Uh, yes, of course, Sharmila Regi as well, for sure. Veena Naregal's work, yes, Anamika, for sure. Prachi Deshpande, of course, I mean, if you're talking about Maharashtra, she again has worked extensively on Maharashtra, but just generally on the public sphere, you can talk about her. Um from the perspective of political science, mm, right. I mean, it's again difficult to talk about things from like specific disciplines. Mm, I think one person is, I mean, you can't, I mean, look beyond him is, I mean, Gopal Guru again, historically, who's again spoken about, not specifically about public sphere, but a lot about uh, how we could understand everyday spaces, for example. So it's related to that, of course, but he's definitely talking about the everyday spaces as such in a more experiential sense. Um but um, there aren't many people actually who are exclusively coming from political science. I feel there are many historians, many philosophers, many social science people, but it's very difficult to think of political scientists as such. But maybe I can think more about this and I can maybe write to you after this call so we can do that. Um, yeah, I think we're done, right, Ganesh? Are there more questions?
Yeah, no questions. And also we are running late, I think. So
Yeah.
5:30. So now I would like to invite Soria to do a formal vote of thanks. Soria, are you
Hi,
there?
thank you. Thank you, Dr. Thube. I'll just formally thank everybody here on behalf of Speaking from Margin team. I would like to extend a sincere thanks to our speaker for a deeply insightful lecture, tracing the emergence of the non-Brahmin print public sphere. It has given a lot of food for thought for all of us. And we are equally grateful to Abhijeet for his incisive engagement, especially rooted in his fieldwork. And before all of that, also like to thank Ganesh for introducing the panel and also curating this. And very much thanks to our engaged audience for the participation and all our members for the constant support to sustain the collective intellectual space that we have here. And we look forward to continuing these conversations. Please stay in touch for our upcoming lectures and events. And the recording of this lecture will be uploaded on the YouTube page so all of us can look back to it later. And yeah, thanks, Dr. Thube again.
Thank you so much.
Bye,
Thank you so much, everyone,
everyone.
for
Bye.
joining.